standard song, a la George Gershwin or Rodgers and Hart. I mean,
Picture the scene. Los Angeles, 1979. Backstage at the legendary Troubadour, the air is thick with music and movement. Guitars are wailing through soundcheck, glasses are clinking, and rock icons are drifting down the hallway like they own the whole world. It is loud, it is electric, and everything feels exactly as it should, until suddenly, it is not. A young assistant bursts into the promoter's office, face pale, barely able to catch his breath. Linda Ronstadt has walked out of the green room again, and the reason is just one name. Not hers, not the Eagles, his. One glance at that name on the performance list, and Linda quietly stood up, gathered herself, walked out of the room, and said absolutely nothing. The silence she left behind was so heavy it seemed to swallow the whole building whole. For years after that night, nobody truly understood what had happened. Linda never explained it. No complaints, no scandal, no public statement. She simply went on with her life, appearing before the world calm, proud, and completely composed. But now, after decades of silence, Linda Ronstadt has finally decided to speak. And if you want to hear every detail of what she revealed, including the names, the moments, and the stories that shocked the entire music world, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a video like this one. Stories like these don't surface every day, and we want you to be here when they do. In a rare and deeply personal interview, Linda revealed 7 names she says she could never forgive. 7 people who wounded her pride, challenged her artistry, and pulled back the curtain on the darker side of the music industry. What surprised everyone who heard this was how unexpected the list turned out to be. These were not small grudges or passing arguments. They were stories that helped define an entire era where power, betrayal, and quiet revenge all lived just beneath the bright lights of rock and roll. And the most startling thing of all was that some of those names once stood closer to her than almost anyone else. The first name on her list belonged to a drummer who rose from almost complete obscurity, lifted by Linda's own support and given his very first real break by her hand, a man who once called himself the heartbeat of his band, a man who, once fame arrived, turned his back and trampled the very path she had helped him build. Before the Eagles became one of the biggest rock bands in history, Don Henley was simply Linda Ronstadt's drummer and backup singer. He was the man she helped bring into the spotlight for the very first time. In the early 1970s, Linda was the rising star. She was selling out theaters from coast to coast, building a reputation as one of the most powerful voices in American music. Henley back then was the quiet drummer sitting in the background, riding the reflection of her success, and grateful, at least on the surface, for the opportunity she had given him. It was Linda who opened that first door for him, the chance that set everything in motion for the rest of his career. But once the Eagles took flight, everything shifted. Henley was no longer the humble musician she had once known. As the band's fame grew larger and larger, so did his ego. The gratitude that had once seemed so real slowly dissolved into pride, and then into something colder. The band that had once opened for Linda now walked down Sunset Boulevard as if they had built it themselves, and Henley, more than any of the others, carried himself like the self-appointed king of Laurel Canyon, distant, untouchable, completely indifferent to the woman who had once given him his first chance. The moment that finally broke everything came in 1975, backstage at the Universal Amphitheater. Henley made a remark that Linda would carry with her for the rest of her life. He mocked her artistic direction, sneering that she should stick to singing other people's songs and leave the real songwriting to real artists. Those words did not just offend her, they erased everything she had spent years fighting for, with passion, discipline, and raw, undeniable talent. But Linda did not shout back. She did not argue or make a scene. She simply turned around, revoked his tour credentials right there on the spot, and walked away without another word. No warning, no second chance. Word spread fast through the music world. Everyone who mattered knew that Henley's ego had spun completely out of control. Friends and colleagues whispered about his cocaine-fueled tantrums, his selfish decisions, and the sharp, cutting words he threw around behind closed doors. For Linda, the deepest wound was not even the betrayal itself, it was the disrespect. In private, she would later describe him with a single haunting phrase, a climber who lost his soul chasing fame. He had gone from a man she believed in to someone she could barely recognize, and that loss was its own kind of grief. But Don Henley was not the only one who crossed the line. The next clash did not happen quietly backstage in a dim hallway. It happened live, in front of a crowd, in a moment of humiliation so raw and so public that Linda Ronstadt would carry it inside her for the rest of her life. The year was 1968. The summer of love had just ended, but its wild, restless energy was still hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The Doors were untouchable at that point, setting every stage they stepped on completely ablaze. And Linda Ronstadt, a young woman with a voice that stopped rooms cold, was still fighting hard to carve out her place in a world that was almost entirely controlled by men. That night, at a private after-party near the Whiskey A Go-Go, legends and outlaws were mingling freely. No ropes, no rules, just music and chaos. Nobody could have predicted what would happen when Jim Morrison spotted Linda across the room. He was already several drinks deep. His shirt was half unbuttoned, and he was moving through the crowd with that wild, magnetic arrogance that made him both impossible to ignore and impossible to trust. Then, in a blur of ego and intoxication, Morrison suddenly pulled Linda up onto the stage without asking, without warning, and without any consideration for what she might want. It was not charming. It was not spontaneous in any good way. It was reckless and invasive and completely disrespectful. Right there in front of everyone, he leaned in and tried to kiss her. Linda reacted on pure instinct. She stepped away. Morrison stumbled, crashing hard into the microphone stand and nearly bringing the whole setup crashing down around him. The room froze. Gasps, stares, silence. Nobody seemed to know whether to laugh or stand still or disappear. No camera caught the moment, but the story lived on anyway, whispered backstage at 100 different shows, retold on late-night radio, growing into an underground legend that simply refused to die. And Morrison never apologized. In fact, he made everything worse. Months later, during a radio interview, he dismissed Linda as sweet but spineless, calling her harmless and forgettable, as if the whole incident had been her failure rather than his. Linda, true to her nature, did not respond publicly. No outrage, no prepared statement. But behind closed doors, the words she chose were precise and devastating. She described him as a brilliant wreck, a man who carried both genius and destruction everywhere he went. To Linda, Jim Morrison was not just a reckless showman, he represented something much larger and much more dangerous, the kind of toxic arrogance that had always tried to dominate and diminish women in the music industry. He was just bold enough to do it in public. But if Morrison's actions left a deep scar, the next betrayal on Linda's list cut even further, because it did not come from a drunken mistake or a moment of recklessness. It came from a friend, someone she had genuinely believed stood beside her, someone whose values she thought she shared, until ideals collided with ego and their friendship shattered beyond any hope of repair. That man was Neil Young. It was 1976, and a major benefit concert for farm workers had brought together some of the most important names in rock. Among them were Linda Ronstadt and Neil Young, two artists known not just for their voices, but for their principles, their beliefs, and their willingness to use their platforms for something bigger than themselves. On stage that day, they appeared united, bound together by a shared purpose. But backstage, even before the first note was played, something was already cracking beneath the surface. Neil began dismissing Linda's input almost immediately. He rejected her suggestions for the set list without explanation. He blocked her from performing certain songs. He criticized her sound, calling it too commercial, too polished, not raw enough for the cause.
And then, after the show, he went even further. He told the press directly that Linda was not built for protest music. The message was unmistakable. In his view, she was not authentic enough to stand beside him on that stage. She was not real enough for the cause they had supposedly both come to support. Linda left the venue in tears. This was not just an insult from a stranger or a dismissive comment from someone she barely knew. This was a betrayal from someone she deeply admired, someone she had believed stood for the same thing she did. To be told by a fellow activist that her voice did not belong, that her commitment was somehow less genuine than his, that wound cut far deeper than any review or headline ever could. It was a wound she did not forget. From that night forward, regardless of the cause or the occasion, Linda refused to share a stage with Neil Young again. Behind closed doors, she described him with words that lingered long after they were spoken. Loud in message, cruel in execution. His activism, she felt, rang completely hollow when paired with that kind of personal cruelty. But if Neil Young's betrayal scarred her personally, a next betrayal on her list would shatter her artistically. Because the next moment of humiliation did not happen behind the scenes, it happened in the middle of a studio session, in front of a full room of musicians, where Linda Ronstadt's confidence was stripped away in an instant by a single cold, dismissive line. The year was 1974, and the meeting between Linda Ronstadt and Frank Zappa had every reason to be something extraordinary. Zappa was eccentric, unpredictable, a mad genius of experimental rock who seemed to operate by rules nobody else understood or had access to. Linda was versatile, fearless, and vocally gifted in a way that almost nobody else in her generation could match. On paper, their collaboration should have been something that pushed both of them into entirely new territory. Instead, it unraveled within hours of beginning. It started with real promise. Linda was genuinely excited to record one of Zappa's compositions. She walked into the studio ready to stretch herself, ready to try something different. But the moment the session began, the atmosphere shifted. Zappa dismissed her creative suggestions with a smirk. He told her that her voice was too clean, too safe. He accused her of watering down his work, of turning raw, living art into something that sounded like a commercial for a product nobody needed. The tension kept building quietly until it finally exploded during a live rehearsal. Midway through a take, Zappa raised his hand and stopped the entire band dead. Complete silence filled the room. And then, slowly and deliberately, in front of every single musician sitting there watching, he said, "This is what happens when you hand real music to a pop singer." Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. Linda did not argue or fight back or try to defend herself. She simply gathered her things, stood up, walked out of the studio, and never came back. She never spoke about it publicly either, but those who knew her best still remembered the words she used when describing it privately. Frank Zappa, brilliant, but brutal. She respected his mind completely, but she could never trust him again. Not after that day. Not after being made to feel small in front of the people whose respect she had every right to expect.
Clashes with difficult artists were one thing, but the next wound on Linda's list went somewhere much more personal, because this betrayal did not come from a difficult creative partner or an unpredictable genius. It came from someone she once called family. In the golden warmth of Laurel Canyon during one of the most creative periods in American music history, Linda Ronstadt and David Crosby were more than just colleagues. They were kindred spirits. They shared stages and studios. They shared beliefs about art and culture and the power of music to change things. Crosby's soaring harmonies and Linda's fearless, genre-crossing voice had both risen on the same revolutionary tide. For a long stretch of time, their bond seemed like something permanent, something built to last. But by 1978, the harmony was beginning to fall apart. During a recording session for a joint project, Linda made a simple and reasonable request, a key change that would better suit her vocal range. It was not a big ask. It was the kind of adjustment musicians make for each other all the time, as a matter of basic professional respect. But Crosby refused. He brushed her off with a cold, dismissive line.
You should learn to adapt. What should have been a minor disagreement quickly turned into something larger. Voices rose, tempers flared. Within days, the story had spread across the canyon, and soon it had made its way into the press, turning a private falling out into one of Laurel Canyon's most talked-about feuds. And then Crosby made it personal. In an interview with Rolling Stone, he dismissed Linda as manufactured, suggesting she was more image than substance, more surface than soul. For a woman who had built her entire career on instinct, honesty, and the pure power of her voice, those words were not just insulting, they were a deep, deliberate betrayal. Linda did not retaliate with interviews or public statements. She said nothing out loud, but her silence was its own kind of answer. Behind the scenes, she made her position completely clear. Crosby's name was banned within her inner circle. Her band was told not to mention him. His songs disappeared from her set lists entirely. In Linda's world, David Crosby simply ceased to exist. He had not just betrayed a friendship, he had betrayed everything that Laurel Canyon had stood for. Authenticity, artistic freedom, and the idea that musicians who believed in something could also be trusted to treat each other with dignity. If Crosby's betrayal was deeply personal, the next name on Linda's list brought something more public and more deliberately cruel. Because this attack did not happen in a studio or a dressing room. It happened in front of reporters, in front of cameras, in a room full of people listening. It was 1979, and a massive music festival in Cleveland had drawn the biggest names in rock together in one place. Linda Ronstadt was at the very top of her powers at that point, commanding, confident, and impossible to ignore. Every eye in the room was on her, until the ridicule began. Among the crowd that day was Elvis Costello, the sharp-tongued new voice of punk and new wave, a man who had built his reputation on tearing apart everything that came before him. Smart, cynical, and entirely unafraid to attack icons in public, Costello had already made his opinion of mainstream rock very clear, but nobody expected what he did next. Surrounded by reporters, he smirked and delivered his remark loud enough for everyone to hear. Her music, he said, sounds like background noise for brunch. It was not criticism, it was a public execution, performed deliberately with an audience watching. The comment spread everywhere almost instantly. It appeared in headlines, got whispered through every green room in the country, and followed Linda wherever she went. She responded by confronting him backstage, hoping for some kind of explanation, maybe even the beginning of an apology. Instead, she found only ice. Costello, reportedly drunk and completely unrepentant, met her eyes, threw out another cutting remark, and walked away without hesitation. Linda never looked back after that. To her, Elvis Costello was not just a rude musician having a bad night. He represented something she genuinely despised about the way the music industry was shifting in that era. He was the face of a new kind of artist, sharp enough to wound, but empty enough not to care. Rebellious in image, but cruel by nature. In his defiance, she saw no real soul at all, only ego dressed up as attitude and mistaken for art. And yet even all of that bitterness faded a little in comparison to the final name on her list, because the last betrayal did not come from a reckless rock star or a cynical provocateur. It came from someone whose voice should have blended perfectly with hers, a partnership that seemed on the surface like it had been written in the stars, but behind studio doors, that dream dissolved quietly into something deeply disappointing.
ยินดีต้อนรับสู่ช่องของเราหากคุณกำลังมองหา SUV ขนาดคอมแพคที่ผสมผสานความทนทานความประหยัดน้ำมันความอเนกประสงค์และสไตล์ที่ทันสมัยได้อย่างลงตัว 2026 Toyota RAV4 อาจเป็นรถที่คุณรอคอยอยู่ก็ได้ยินดีต้อนรับกลับสู่ช่องอีกครั้งวันนี้เราจะพาคุณไปเจาะลึกหนึ่งใน SUV ที่ขายดีที่สุดในโลกนั่นก็คือ 2026 Toyota RAV4 ตลอดหลายปีที่ผ่านมา RAV4 ได้สร้างชื่อเสียงด้านความเชื่อถือได้และการใช้งานในชีวิตประจำวัน และสำหรับปี 2026 Toyota ได้พัฒนาให้ดียิ่งขึ้นด้วยเทคโนโลยีที่ฉลาดขึ้น ดีไซน์ที่เฉียบคมขึ้น และตัวเลือกสมรรถนะที่หลากหลายมากขึ้น เริ่มจากภายนอก 2026 RAV4 ยังคงเอกลักษณ์การออกแบบที่ดูบึกบึนและโดดเด่น ด้านหน้ามาพร้อมกระจังหน้าใหม่ที่ดูดุดันกว่าเดิม ไฟหน้า LED ดีไซน์เพรียวบาง และกันชนหน้าที่ออกแบบใหม่ให้ดูแข็งแกร่ง เส้นลายตัวถังมีความคมชัดและสปอร์ต สร้างภาพลักษณ์ที่ทันสมัยและมีพลัง ล้ออัลลอยมีให้เลือกตั้งแต่ขนาด 17 ถึง 19 นิ้วตามรุ่น พร้อมคิ้วกันกระแทกสีดำที่เพิ่มความเป็น SUV มากยิ่งขึ้น รุ่นท็อปยังมีหลังคาสีตัดและรายละเอียดพิเศษที่ช่วยให้รถดูโดดเด่นมากขึ้น ด้านท้ายมาพร้อมไฟท้าย LED ดีไซน์ใหม่ และฝาท้ายที่เรียบหรูทำให้ภาพรวมดูพรีเมียมและทันสมัย เหมาะทั้งการผจญภัยและการใช้งานในเมือง ห้องผู้โดยสารของ 2026 RAV4 ให้ความรู้สึกพรีเมียมและเน้นเทคโนโลยีมากขึ้น Toyota ได้ปรับปรุงวัสดุให้มีความนุ่มนวลมากขึ้น พร้อมเบาะนั่งที่สบายยิ่งขึ้น แผงคอนโซลออกแบบให้ใช้งานง่าย และเน้นผู้ขับขี่เป็นศูนย์กลาง หน้าจออินโฟเทนเมนต์แบบลอยตัวขนาดใหญ่ตอบสนองได้รวดเร็ว รองรับ Wireless Apple CarPlay และ Android Auto เป็นมาตรฐาน พร้อมพอร์ต USB-C หลายตำแหน่ง และระบบชาร์จไร้สาย หน้าจอแสดงผลข้อมูลการขับขี่แบบดิจิทัล ให้ภาพคมชัด และสามารถปรับแต่งข้อมูลได้ตามต้องการ พื้นที่ภายในยังคงเป็นจุดเด่นของ RAV4 มีพื้นที่วางขาและศีรษะกว้างขวางทั้งด้านหน้าและด้านหลัง เหมาะสำหรับครอบครัวหรือการเดินทางไกล พื้นที่เก็บสัมภาระด้านท้ายกว้างขวาง พื้นที่วางของต่ำ และเบาะหลังพับราบได้เพื่อเพิ่มความจุ ไม่ว่าจะเป็นของใช้ประจำวัน กระเป๋าตังเดินทาง หรืออุปกรณ์ท่องเที่ยว RAV4 ก็รองรับได้อย่างสบาย รุ่นสูงยังมาพร้อมเบาะนั่งปรับอากาศ หลังคาซันรูฟแบบพาโนรามา ไฟสร้างบรรยากาศภายใน และระบบเครื่องเสียงพรีเมียมที่ช่วยยกระดับประสบการณ์การขับขี่ ด้านสมรรถนะ 2026 RAV4 มีตัวเลือกเครื่องยนต์หลากหลาย เครื่องยนต์เบนซินมาตรฐานให้ความนุ่มนวลและประหยัดน้ำมัน เหมาะสำหรับการใช้งานในชีวิตประจำวัน สำหรับผู้ที่ต้องการความประหยัดมากขึ้น รุ่นไฮบริดก็ยังคงเป็นตัวเลือกที่โดดเด่น ให้ทั้งพลังและอัตราสิ้นเปลืองที่ยอดเยี่ยม นอกจากนี้ยังมีรุ่นปลั๊กอินไฮบริดที่สามารถขับขี่ด้วยพลังงานไฟฟ้าได้มากขึ้น พร้อมสมรรถนะโดยรวมที่แข็งแกร่ง คุณภาพการขับขี่ให้ความรู้สึกสบายและมั่นคง ไม่ว่าจะขับในเมืองหรือบนทางหลวง พวงมาลัยตอบสนองแม่นยำ และระบบกันสะเทือนช่วยซับแรงสะเทือนได้ดี รุ่นที่มีระบบขับเคลื่อน 4 ล้อช่วยเพิ่มความมั่นใจในสภาพถนนลื่น หรือเส้นทางออฟโรดเบาๆ ด้านความปลอดภัยมาพร้อมชุดระบบความปลอดภัยล่าสุดของ Toyota เช่น ระบบควบคุมความเร็วอัตโนมัติแบบแปรผัน ระบบช่วยควบคุมรถให้อยู่ในเลน ระบบเตือนจุดอับสายตา และระบบเบรกฉุกเฉินอัตโนมัติ เพื่อความอุ่นใจสูงสุดของผู้ขับขี่และผู้โดยสาร ในด้านราคา 2026 RAV4 ยังคงมีความสามารถในการแข่งขันในกลุ่ม SUV ขนาด Compact รุ่นเริ่มต้นคาดว่าจะมีราคาที่เข้าถึงได้ ส่วนรุ่นสูงที่มาพร้อมระบบไฮบริดหรือ Plug-in Hybrid และอุปกรณ์พรีเมียมก็จะมีราคาสูงขึ้นตามลำดับ แต่อย่างไรก็ตามด้วยชื่อเสียงด้านความทนทาน มูลค่าขายต่อที่ดี และค่าบำรุงรักษาที่ไม่สูง RAV4 จึงถือว่าเป็นรถที่คุ้มค่าในระยะยาว สิ่งที่ทำให้ 2026 RAV4 โดดเด่นคือความสมดุล รถรุ่นนี้ไม่ได้พยายามหวือหวาเกินไป แต่เน้นตอบโจทย์ความต้องการของผู้ใช้จริง ทั้งความสบาย ความประหยัด ความปลอดภัย และความอเนกประสงค์ในดีไซน์ที่ทันสมัย ไม่ว่าคุณจะเป็นคนทำงาน ครอบครัวขนาดเล็ก หรือผู้ที่ต้องการ SUV ที่ไว้วางใจได้ทุกวัน RAV4 ก็ตอบโจทย์ได้อย่างครบถ้วนToyota ได้พัฒนารถรุ่นนี้จากเสียงตอบรับของลูกค้าและปรับปรุงในจุดที่สำคัญที่สุดด้วยเทคโนโลยีที่ดีขึ้นดีไซน์ที่สดใสตัวเลือกพลังงานที่หลากหลายและระบบความปลอดภัยที่ล้ำสมัย 2026 RAV4 ยังคงรักษาตำแหน่งหนึ่งใน SUV ขนาด Compact ที่ดีที่สุดในตลาด สำหรับวันนี้ก็ขอจบการรีวิวเพียงเท่านี้ หากคุณชื่นชอบวิดีโอนี้อย่าลืมกดไลค์กดติดตามและรอติดตามรีวิวรถยนต์แบบเจาะลึกเพิ่มเติมได้ที่ช่องของเราขอบคุณที่รับชมแล้วพบกันใหม่ในวิดีโอหน้า
someone whose sound should have
Smart,
meshed perfectly
cynical,
with hers.
and unafraid
A
to
voice
tear
so
down the
compatible it
icons who
seemed
came
faded.
before him.
But it was a
no one
different
could have
story
anticipated
behind the
how
scenes.
cruel his next
Their
move
partnership
would be.
transformed from
Surrounded by
fantasy
reporters,
to unspoken
Costello
disaster.
smirked and delivered his
Perfection
verbal
or
dagger.
control.
Her
Paul
music
Simon's
sounds
cold
like
dismissal.
background noise
It was
for brunch.
1982, and it
It
seemed
wasn't
perfect.
just a jab.
Paul Simon,
It was a
one of the
public
most admired
humiliation.
songwriters of his
The
time,
comments spread
teaming
like
up with Linda
wildfire,
Ronstadt,
splashed
the
across
reigning
headlines
queen of
and
vocal
whispered
boundary
through
pushing.
every green room
When it
in
was
the country.
announced that they would be recording
Linda,
a duet
hurt but
on his new
composed,
album,
confronted him
fans and
backstage,
critics were
hoping for an
overjoyed.
explanation,
On
maybe
paper,
even
it
an
was
apology.
magic waiting to happen.
Instead,
In
she
real
found
life,
only
it turned
ice.
into a slow
Costello,
disintegration.
reportedly drunk and
From the
defiant,
very first
met her
rehearsal,
gaze,
there was
threw out
no
another
chemistry.
cutting remark,
Simon
and
did
walked
not
away,
like every note,
utterly
halting
unrepentant.
takes to
From
rephrase
that
things
moment,
that did not need
Linda
to be
never looked
rephrased.
back.
He
To
rewrote
her,
parts of the
Elvis
song
Costello
without
was more than a
informing
rude
her,
musician.
presenting
He embodied
suggestions
something
that
darker,
came across
something she
as
despised
veiled
about the
criticism.
shifting music
Those
scene.
who worked with
He was
Linda
the
later
face of a new
explained
kind of
that she
artist.
explained the experience in one
Sharp-minded
hurting
but
sentence.
cold-hearted,
It felt like
endlessly
being
critical,
scolded
yet empty
by a
of
school
empathy.
principal.
Not rebellious,
Each note she sang was
just cruel for
analyzed,
the sake
not
of attention.
enjoyed.
In
Each
his
take
defiance,
was followed
Linda
by
saw
fixing,
no soul,
not harmony.
only ego.
Whatever magic
And yet,
they could have
even
had
that
was
bitterness
drowned
paled
by
in
mountains of
comparison to
ego
the final
and
heartbreak
domination.
on her list.
The chemistry
Because
never
the last
worked.
name wasn't a
The
reckless
song was
rocker
left
or a
incomplete,
swaggering upstart.
set aside,
It was someone
ignored,
whose voice
never
should have blended
recorded,
perfectly
and
with
never
hers.
mentioned ever again.
A partnership
But
that
to Linda,
seemed destined.
the hurt went so much
behind
deeper
studio
than an
doors,
unreleased
that
recording.
dream dissolved
It wasn't
quietly
about one record.
into disaster.
It was about pride, about
Perfection
being
or
respected
control.
as an artist.
Paul Simon's
Her
cold
voice
dismissal.
deserved
In
collaboration.
1982,
What she got
the
was
idea
an
sounded
autocracy.
flawless.
From
Paul
that point
Simon,
on,
one of the most
Linda
revered
promised herself
songwriters
a
of his
silent
generation,
vow.
teaming
She
up
would
with
never
Linda
record
Ronstadt,
with Paul
the
Simon
reigning queen
once
of
more.
fearless vocals.
And with that last break,
When news of their
the silence
collaboration
around
broke,
Linda
fans
Ronstadt's
and critics
deepest
alike were
betrayals
thrilled.
started
It
to
seemed
disintegrate.
destined for greatness,
7
a
musicians,
marriage of
7
artistry and
wounds,
freedom.
all covered up under
But what
decades of
followed was a
elegance.
slow
Until
unraveling.
now.
From the
Because
very
behind
first
every
rehearsal,
harmony,
the
there is a
chemistry was
tale
off.
no one
Paul
listens
Simon dissected
until
every
someone
note,
finally chooses to
interrupting
share it.
takes to correct
So why didn't
phrasing
she
that
speak out
needed
all
no
these
correction.
years?
He
Easy.
rewrote sections
Linda
of the
Ronstadt
song
never
without
was the
telling
type
her,
to pursue
calling his
rumors
changes
or stoke tabloid
suggestions.
wars. For
To Linda,
decades,
those
she used her
suggestions
voice.
felt like cuts,
But this news isn't
small,
revenge.
sharp,
It's about
deliberate.
truth.
Later,
Linda
she would
established her
describe
legacy
the
not only
experience
on
in
great
one
talent,
painful
but on
sentence.
longevity, riding
It
out
felt like being
egos,
scolded
betrayals,
by a school
and an
principal.
industry that
Every
consistently
note
showed
she
no
sang
compassion.
was analyzed,
And in
not
shattering her
appreciated.
silence now,
Every
she's
take
not bringing
met with
someone down.
criticism,
She's
not
laying bare the
collaboration.
price of staying
Whatever
strong in a
spark
world
might have existed
that does not
was
often
buried
permit
beneath
women
ego
to be
and control.
brilliant and
The song
unapologetic.
was never finished, shelved, forgotten, left to rot in silence. But for Linda, the wound went far beyond a lost recording. It wasn't about one song. It was about dignity, about being treated as less than the artist she was. A voice like hers deserved partnership, not authority. Instead of a collaborator, she found herself facing a dictator. That day, she made herself a quiet promise. She would never record with Paul Simon again. And with that final fracture, the silence surrounding Linda Ronstadt's 7 greatest betrayals began to unravel. 7 names. 7 scars. All hidden beneath decades of grace, until now. Because behind every harmony lies a story no one hears. Until someone finally decides to tell it. So why did Linda stay silent all those years? The answer is simple. She never chased gossip, never played the tabloid game. For decades, she let her voice speak for her. And now, in breaking that silence, she isn't seeking revenge. She's reclaiming truth. Linda Ronstadt's legacy was built not only on brilliance, but on endurance, surviving egos, betrayals, and an industry that rarely allowed women to be both talented and unapologetic. Because sometimes, the greatest power doesn't lie in the songs we sing, but in the silence we finally choose to break. Which story shocked you the most? And do you think Linda was right to stay silent all these years? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.